So hey, I'm glad your search for the best 4K gaming monitor has led you to this video, because today we're going to be talking about two monitors near and dear to my heart. I've had them now for a couple of months each, and I've been able to stress test the heck out of them. So today we're going to be covering and comparing the G70A by Samsung and the M28U by Gigabyte. And I'm going to go in depth. We're going to talk a lot about menus, performance, features, specs, things like that. And then we're going to get into some real world gameplay so you guys can see the differences firsthand in this video. So let's dive in, you guys, and check out what we find. So on the right hand side, we have the Samsung G70A, and on the left hand side, the Gigabyte M28U. First and foremost, these guys are similarly spec'd. They're both IPS monitors. They're both 144 Hertz. They're both 4K in resolution. They're both HDR 400, have HDMI 2.1, and a couple other features that differentiate them. For example, the Gigabyte M28U is a KVM style, while the Samsung G70A is G-Sync compatible. Those are two different technologies that these two monitors boast and might suit you depending on what you do for workload. Now, they're both very similar in their makeup. They have menus that can control everything from your pixel response rate to your black level adjust. A notable mention by Samsung is they do have a low input lag feature, and that does pair well with console gaming and PC gaming. On the other hand, Gigabyte has some very in-depth menus that allow you to calibrate in ways that other monitors just don't allow. The actual styling of the menus are entirely different. Gigabyte's is this big black box that literally takes up a third of your screen, but it's so in depth you can pretty much calibrate anything you want. Whereas Samsung's is a bit more elegant and gamer-like. It's new age tech. That's something that I like about Samsung, is they're always trying to be on the edge of that modern look. And speaking of aesthetics, that's kind of the difference between the two. The Gigabyte M28U has a good, aggressive, rugged style. It's got this kind of unique pattern on the back that signifies it's a Gigabyte monitor. It has a great stand that allows for tilting, it allows for height adjustment, panning, and it even has good cable management in the back. While Samsung's is a bit more like a spaceship, kind of like, you know, you're on the Star Trek Enterprise or something like that. It's got a really cool RGB look. It's got these lines, these details that are just really smooth and kind of bubbly looking. And that is entirely different than the Gigabyte M28U. Now, it also has good features like tilting, height adjustment, pan left and right. And that's what you should expect when you're spending $600 plus on a monitor. Now, I want to establish two baselines. Number one, I've done full reviews, in-depth reviews, 20 minutes plus on each one of these monitors individually. But I am going to go through some baseline testing just to start. Now, the second part to that is each monitor is calibrated to my own specific calibration. I didn't try to put them on factory. I didn't try to put them on any special setting. I did the calibration that I used in each individual review video. So you can either go check out those videos and see how I calibrated it, or you can use the calibration numbers that I have below for your testing or for your setup. But starting out, we're gonna do a simple uniformity test. And this is real basic, just gray uniformity, seeing which one does better or if they score similarly. Now, both of these panels are a full array edge-lit style panel, which means they have dimmable zones that allow them to have better uniformity and a higher contrast. And you can see here, hopefully you can see and view exactly what I'm seeing. The Samsung monitor is a lot more consistent, while the M28U is actually a little bit darker and has a bit more splotchiness to it. Yeah, that's a very technical term, splotchy. But you can see that the Samsung is actually staying brighter while retaining that uniformity just a bit better. Okay, and if any of you watch my channel, you know that I play this HDR video here all the time. It's a 4K video on YouTube, and it has a fantastic color. And I like to pause on a few of these settings to get an idea of the differences. And what I'm gonna do here is I'm actually gonna bring that brightness up on the Gigabyte, see if I can get it to match the Samsung right now. Now, here's a difference that I notice right now. If I zoom in on this kind of turquoise pearl down here, we can just notice that the Samsung has a bit more detail down there in kind of these smaller portions of the image, in the granules of the, I don't know what it is, maybe it's sand or something, but there's just a bit more detail being pulled out. Neither of them are doing bad, actually. They're both doing an extremely good job. But you can just tell at that very minute level that the Samsung is pulling out a bit of extra detail, and that has to do with like processing power behind the hardware that they use inside the panel, telling the lighting display what to do. Now, what's happening here is a bit interesting, because what we notice is that the M28U actually has a bit of deeper color here in that darker area, like those purples, and again, going back to the blue pearls. It's just a bit deeper in its color, and maybe because the calibration is a bit different here, but I noticed that off the bat. Yeah, brilliant. Perfect pause. Once again, the Gigabyte just has that deeper magenta that it's pulling out. Somewhat of a deeper blue in that middle area that you'll see between the two. And again, that's probably calibration, but I know from my actual testing, my full in-depth review, the color scale was actually a little bit better on the Gigabyte M28U in some areas. So I'm actually kind of stoked about this next bit because we're going to be getting into blur busters. And I'm actually going to use the original video that I had and the stops and pauses that I used to compare the two. So the initial full stop here, what we notice is that the Samsung, actually on its mid frames and its lowest frames per second, it's actually overshooting that image quite a bit, while the Gigabyte M28U is actually holding very strong. There is no overshoot and no ghosting. So initial testing out of the box, Gigabyte is kind of taking a one up right here. And then we pause on the world motion blur here, and I gotta be honest with you guys, neither one of them is doing a fantastic job just out of the box. The Samsung looks slightly better with that world motion blur handling, but the Gigabyte it's got a lot of kind of smearing going on between both the top bar and the bottom. By the way, the top is the lower frames per second and the bottom is the higher frames per second. Now we're on to the pixel overdrive test, and I'm not going to put a bunch of time into this because the settings are entirely different. Samsung's a lot more traditional. They have like standard, faster, extreme. Then they have their motion blur reduction technology. I talked about it in the full review. You guys can go check that out if you want to know more about that motion blur reduction. And while the Gigabyte kind of has, their settings are more geared towards the result that you want. They have things like balance, quality, smart overdrive. They kind of have that smart feature built into the monitor throughout many of their settings. However, there are some similarities between the two, and we'll kind of talk about it and see what I find. So we're going to start out with the normal setting on the Samsung and jump and compare that to one of the standard settings on the Gigabyte. So I'm going to compare the normal to the smart overdrive here on the Gigabyte. So I think that's a fair comparison in my opinion. And actually they're looking very similar. If we look at the Samsung, we're seeing a bit of ghosting in that higher frames per second, while over at the Gigabyte, we're seeing overshoot, which is interesting. So they're doing exactly the opposite of each other. And that's in the top frames per second. Now, if we look at the middle and the bottom frames, there's a tad bit of ghosting on the Samsung, while the Gigabyte is actually retaining both images and refreshing very, very well. So kind of a tie right now between the two because the ghosting is much worse on that top frame, the overshoot of the Gigabyte than it is on the Samsung. So right now it's actually very par for par. Now we're going to compare the faster setting on the Samsung to the balanced setting on the Gigabyte. Faster being kind of the step up, where balanced might be in between normal and faster. So I feel like it's a good middle of the road. So comparing that, the balance on the M28U is pretty bad. It's pretty poor. While this faster setting on the Samsung is doing a little bit for us. I mean, the main difference is it's adding overdrive to that middle frame per second performance and a bit of overdrive to that top frame. And when I said doing more for us, I didn't necessarily mean it's better. It actually didn't perform as well as the normal setting, and the Gigabyte, same thing, did not perform as well as its kind of standard smart overdrive setting. Ah, yes, okay, so I have a secret for you guys looking at the Gigabyte M28U, and you may have seen it in other reviews, but I am actually now going to compare, and this is gonna sound a bit odd, the off setting to the fastest setting on the Samsung overdrive setting. So the reason why, and I'll kind of give you a bit of information, the off setting was actually one of the best performing settings in most scenarios on the Gigabyte M28U, which is a bit interesting. While the fastest setting on the Samsung actually performs really well at high frames per second. So let's dive in, let's see what we find here. And that's actually the extreme setting for Samsung, not the fastest setting. So initial pause here, what we notice is the M28U in its off setting is actually outperforming the Samsung G70A. There's a slight bit of kind of smearing happening with that G70A and a bit of ghosting and overshoot on those top frames. While the Gigabyte did extremely well with the off setting, it would seem that the normal setting or faster setting from Samsung perform almost identical, a teeny bit of overshoot, while the pixel response rate overdrive setting being off on the Gigabyte actually outperforms both the Samsung in any of its settings. So that's actually a win for the Gigabyte, surprisingly. So next up, I want to test a bit of like fidelity within gameplay. And as always, I pull up Metro Exodus Enhanced. That's just my favorite game to really get into, dive in, and kind of see what the visuals are like. You know, and there's something to be said about this Gigabyte because, like I mentioned in the very beginning, the menus are phenomenal, especially when it comes to HDR color calibration. So if you're playing a game like Metro Exodus and you want to be able to play in HDR, you want that full ray tracing capability, you want that deep, good color tone and that color pop, we see differences in the way that these two can calibrate. Now, the Samsung isn't fully locked down like a lot of other monitors. It has local dimming control. It does have brightness control, contrast control, sharpness control, color control, but it is missing out on some black level control. It is missing out on an overall level of brightness that you might expect from a monitor like this. While the Gigabyte M28U has light enhance, color enhance, dark enhance, local dimming, and it does have some other gaming features that you can calibrate as well. So pixel overdrive, things like that. But they both score really well in this game. They both actually, in my opinion, are almost par for par. I prefer the Samsung G70A. That's my preference, not necessarily one I would say you should prefer or not. My preference is the G70A. I felt like it had more of a color pop. It had more realistic color, and overall, that fidelity, that extra level of processing that the internal hardware of the Samsung G70A have led to a better experience. But you guys can look at the video yourself and compare it. Check out the full video for review if you want. So I have two more tests for you guys, and the next two are actually going to be real games that we're going to be testing somewhat side by side. What I'm going to do with this particular test here is it's the Borderlands 3 benchmark. All right, jumping in on that Gigabyte M28U here on Borderlands. So the Gigabyte's holding up strong. The fidelity here is really good. It's not flat. It's not flat whatsoever. Getting about 65 frames per second. The color's rich. I mean, the pond here, the reflections, the color and the detail. I love this style of artwork that Borderlands has. And a 4K screen just like this, I mean, it does wonders for it. Getting a bit more into the bright side here. Oh, that's really clean though, super clean. This particular part can be difficult for GPUs. A lot of up close detail. And I know it's not like a, you know, super high fidelity, but the artwork just with that detail is really cool. So I'm interested to actually see how the Samsung does here. You know, that's a pretty hard bar to beat because it did extremely well on the M28U. And firing up the Samsung. Ooh, super clean. Wow, really clean here, you guys. The pond is a little more flat, I feel like, on the Samsung though. Okay, getting into that darker scene, darker atmosphere, a little bit of a foggy layer happening here. And the Samsung, it's not falling flat, but it was a bit hazy there for a second. Just the detail you get on these up close objects as we pan around them, just a phenomenal quality, no matter which monitor you're using. This is the kicker though right here. Oh, that acid just reflections there. The up close detail, the line work. Yeah, the way that explosion hit. I felt that was a bit smoother here on the Samsung than it was on the Gigabyte. I'll put a little side by side so you guys can see him in action here, but this is a tough one. So the last bit of testing here, you guys, is a real world gameplay on Warzone. So we're gonna do just a quick match. We got a bit of Warzone open here, you guys. We're gonna be playing just a quick round of Resurgence here. I mean, motion's holding really strong. I'm capped. I'm at 144 frames, 130 frames. What I notice right now is that the motion is extremely smooth on this Samsung, like really smooth, you guys. The experience is like butter. There's no stutter, no lag. I'm moving my mouse, I'm hitting my keys. It's perfect. Yeah, jumping in on this M28U, you guys. I mean, picture-wise, the picture quality is great. I'm seeing a lot of really good color here. But the one thing I will mention is that the motion handling just doesn't feel the same. Every click of the button with that Samsung was just, it felt like butter. Here I feel like I'm having to like press harder to get that connection. And you know, there's been some criticism about the input lag of the M28U. I personally also made that criticism, but it shows almost immediately. Wow, that was an intense interaction. I did okay, but that motion was just a little off on the Gigabyte. Even though I thought it was a good experience, that motion handling just isn't quite there compared to the Samsung. Like you jump from one to the other and you notice a world of difference when you're the one driving the game. So we're gonna go up, guys. We're gonna talk about what I think the difference is and which one I would recommend. So there surely is a lot I can talk about with both of these monitors, and I think they both did fairly well today. Obviously, I believe one did better than the other, and you can probably guess where I'm leaning on this. You know, when it came to kind of the synthetic benchmarks, the Gigabyte kind of had the lead. Just on paper, if you look at it, cost analysis, performance analysis, and you do some general synthetic benchmarking, it holds up really well. Then you get behind the wheel and it starts to fall back a little. And, you know, maybe that can change depending on the setup you're using, depending on the PC you have. For me, because I have G-Sync, sitting behind the wheel of the Samsung G70A was butter. The performance and that compatibility with G-Sync took the cake for me. Even though it scored lower in the pixel response rate test we did on Blur Busters, just that general feel when you sit down, you put your hand on the keys, your hand on the mouse, was by far a far superior experience. At least for me it was. And that's why I don't really have to say any more. You guys can watch the full videos if you want breakdowns. I think with everything that you get from the Samsung G70A, the added features, especially if it's on sale, it is absolutely worth a little bit more money to have that peace of mind knowing you're getting the best performance in game where it matters. Almost everything else was par for par. It was really close. Probably a calibration point or two away when you look at those other synthetic tests. So that's why I'm telling you, just like I did in my original review of the G70A, it's still my #1 pick for 4K 144Hz HDMI 2.1 monitors. All right, you guys, well, I appreciate you watching the video and sticking with me this far throughout the process. And if you haven't already, go check out the homepage. We have tons of videos, you guys, tons of playlists. I'm gonna put one up above for you guys to check out, and that's gonna be a full playlist of all the gaming monitors that I've reviewed on the channel. So go check it out. And if you haven't yet, please consider joining as a member to help support the channel. It's a great way to give insight to us, be a part of the channel, and get some interactive content or maybe even some pre-release content. So check out that membership, you guys. Without further ado, I'll catch you in the next video.